The life of Galileo Galilei is defined by three distinct eras: a youth of rudderless uncertainty, a working career of increasing wealth, respect, and prestige, and finally a decline marked by controversy, loss, illness, and alienation. The fulcrum on which his fortunes turned was the year 1611. That year marked the beginning of a series of vehement and often needless confrontations in which Galileo engaged, to much detriment and little gain, with various enemies, real, imagined, and made. To this day, Galileo's behavior in this period has remained a puzzle, one that, as Arthur Koestler put it in his famous summation, can only be explained in psychological terms. He was certain that Copernicanism, a universe with the sun at its center, was correct, and was willing to go to any length to ensure its victory in the philosophical arena. For us, with the benefit of hindsight, this conviction and determination can seem noble, but as we shall see, Galileo was equally convinced and determined to promote ideas that were not only manifestly wrong, but contrary to both the opinions of his peers and simple observations. Galileo was an intellectual fire that burned out of control. As with many fires, he left new life in his wake, but also burned any structures that might have defended him. His first spark was struck against an old adversary, the Aristotelians. Despite the recent wave of discoveries disproving Aristotle's claims, many of them made by Galileo himself, and their subsequent endorsement by the Jesuits, universities remained perpetually in Aristotle's grasp, even to the time of Newton. Not one university professor endorsed a single claim of Galileo's during his lifetime, on any topic whatsoever. Over time, university Aristotelians would form the backbone of the movement against Galileo, and their poster child was Lodovico della Colombe. Colombe and Galileo had crossed swords as far back as the supernova of 1604, of which Colombe had, of course, presented the Aristotelian view that, as change and corruption could not occur in the celestial realm, it must have been an atmospheric phenomenon, while Galileo cited Tycho's parallax measurements, which showed that the supernova had to have occurred beyond the moon. Galileo published a pseudonymous rebuttal of Colombe, which referred to him snidely as, quote, Nostro Colombo, or our pigeon, a term meaning a simpleton. Colombe was no simpleton, and he wasn't fooled by the pseudonym. The daggers were out. In 1610, in response to Galileo's starry messenger, which made a quick reference to the motion of the earth, quote, We shall prove the earth to be a wandering body surpassing the moon in splendor, not the sink of all dull refuse of the universe. This we shall support by an infinitude of arguments drawn from nature. Colombe published a pamphlet which, while not widely circulated, opened a new front in the battle against Galileo. For the first time, Colombe, who was neither a cleric nor a theologian, quoted scripture against Galileo's arguments. It was a stone that would trigger a landslide. For all that, Galileo's ultimate confrontation with Colombe concerned something far more mundane. In July 1611, Galileo conducted a debate about the nature of cold with two Aristotelians, both of whom took Aristotle's position that ice, as it was frozen water, must be denser than water and so floated because of its flat shape. It should be noted at this point that neither ancient Greeks nor 17th century Florentines were likely to have seen icebergs. Galileo, drawing on Archimedes, argued that shape had no role in flotation, only density, and that ice had to be less dense than water. In response, Colombe, proving that he was as much a showman as Galileo, performed live experiments to enthralled crowds in town squares, in which he floated an ebony ball and an ebony chip, both of the same density, only to have the ball sink to the bottom. Galileo, unable to explain this, speculated that the chip had to be floating on a cushion of air. In fact, neither of the two were right, although it was hardly their fault. The secrets of surface tension and the hydrogen bond would not be understood for 300 years. The most significant event to emerge from this altercation was the formation of an ad hoc alliance of incensed Aristotelians and chagrined churchmen, with the single aim of taking down Galileo, which Galileo derisively nicknamed the Pigeon League. With its rise, the value of Aristotelianism would be tied ever more closely to biblical authority. While its power was growing, Galileo still had allies in the Church, in particular Cardinal Bellarmine, who took Galileo's side in a subsequent debate on flotation. A fellow Florentine and Pisa graduate, Bellarmine would have a sizable impact on Galileo's future. In 1612, Galileo singed another sapling, Christoph Scheiner, a German astronomer and Jesuit priest, whose published observations of sunspots piqued Galileo's ire. Their principal debate was not about priority, though Galileo did briefly attempt to assert this, despite sunspots having been recorded for thousands of years, but about the nature of sunspots themselves. Scheiner, instinctively conservative, believed them to be orbiting bodies passing over the sun's disk, and even cited Galileo's discovery of the moons of Jupiter as precedent. Galileo countered that they could not be planets, as they were irregular in both shape and opacity, and more resembled clouds. He also noted that, as they approached or moved away from the edge of the sun, they appeared to shorten, clump together, and slow. Galileo realized, correctly, that this was due to them briefly moving toward his eye, as they would if they were following the curve of the sun. He noted, again correctly, that if the sunspots were substantially above the sun, such foreshortening would be both faster and later than observed. That said, he also argued incorrectly that sunspots traveled the same speed regardless of latitude, while Scheiner happily corrected him that they travel faster at the equator. Galileo's arguments on sunspots would prove yet another nail in Aristotle's cosmological coffin. The celestial spheres were imperfect and blemished, however we may try to spare their blushes. The pair's initial debate was relatively civil, but it would return to haunt Galileo some years later. It marked the beginning of his rift with the Jesuits, the same order that had feted him like a king the previous year. 1612 saw the death of Christopher Clavius, the Jesuit leader who was Galileo's closest ally in the clergy. There would soon be few left to help him. Galileo had a particular knack for turning friends into enemies. By far the most famous of Galileo's early confrontations was with the German astronomer Simon Mayr, better known by his Latin style, Simon Marius. Galileo was predisposed to mistrust Marius, as the man had played a peripheral role in Baldassare Capra's cack-handed attempt to steal credit for Galileo's military compass several years earlier. In fact, Galileo seemed to view Marius as the corrupting mastermind behind Capra's scheme, possibly because Capra's father was a friend of his. Nonetheless, Marius's association with Capra's theft appears to have occurred largely in Galileo's own mind, as he had left Padua 2 years before. In a mirror of Galileo's own tale, in 1609, Marius, from his base in Ansbach, having heard of the recent invention then called the spyglass, constructed his own. And on the 29th of December, 1509, Marius recorded observing the moons of Jupiter. This would appear to give Marius priority over Galileo, but, as Galileo himself pointed out, Marius, like all, quote, Protestant heretics, used the archaic Julian calendar, which was roughly 10 days out of sync with the Catholic Gregorian calendar. With the adjustments in place, Marius's date of discovery becomes the 8th of January 1610, 1 day after Galileo. While from an outside perspective this seems perfectly innocent, to Galileo this was a deliberate deception, using the discrepancy between the two calendars to assert priority that was not his. And in 1614, when Marius finally published his discovery, Galileo did not take it well. Writing in the Assayer nearly a decade later, Galileo not only resurrected the old claims about his compass, but said that Marius, quote, had the temerity to claim that he had observed these Medicean planets which revolve about Jupiter before I had done so. But because it rarely happens that truth allows herself to be surpassed by falsehood, you may see how he himself, through his carelessness and lack of understanding, gives me in that very work of his the means of convicting him by irrefutable testimony and revealing unmistakably his error, showing not only that he did not observe said stars before me, but even that he did not certainly see them until 2 years afterwards. Galileo believed that as Jupiter was below the ecliptic at the time, the moon's orbit should be tilted upwards towards our eyes, while Marius had claimed that they were tilted downwards, which Galileo argued would not be true until 2 years later. In fact, they were both wrong, as all the Galilean satellites' orbits are separately inclined relative to Jupiter. Much like that of Galileo himself, opinion of Marius and his priority has swung wildly with time, from abject vilification at times when Galileo was ascendant, to cloying veneration when Galileo declined. Alexander von Humboldt, the 18th century explorer who was considered the founder of ecology, claimed that Marius had discovered the moons before Galileo. Today, majority academic opinion grants Galileo priority in the discovery of the appropriately named Galilean satellites. But you could argue that 400 years later, it is Marius who ultimately won. While the public mind rightly associates Galileo with the discovery of those 4 moons, its eye tends to focus more on Galileo's controversies and arguments with the Church than with his discoveries with the telescope. Meanwhile, as those satellites, long called simply 1, 2, 3, and 4, came into focus as individual, vibrant, living worlds, it is by Marius's names, Io, Europa, Ganymede, and Callisto, that they eventually became known. If you wanted to time to the minute the beginning of Galileo's downfall, you could do worse than the morning of the 12th of December, 1613, when a servant of the Grand Duchess Christina ordered Benedetto Castelli back to her breakfast table. Castelli was a lifelong friend of Galileo and a highly accomplished scientist in his own right, an atomist at a time when such opinions were heretical, and a Copernican, but also a Benedictine monk. He developed the first safe way of viewing sunspots, by projecting the sun's image through a telescope onto a white sheet. He is considered the father of hydrodynamics, and at the time had only just assumed Galileo's old post at the University of Pisa, on condition that he never mentioned Copernicanism. Castelli had reminded his superiors that Galileo had held the same post for 20 years without doing so. On the day in question, Castelli, on a visit to Pisa, was attending breakfast with Galileo's patroness, the Grand Duchess Christina of Tuscany, and her mother. Also at the table was Cosimo Boscaglia, an Aristotelian philosopher, who, as Aristotelians were increasingly prone to do, argued that, while Galileo deserved all due credit for his discoveries, the motion of the earth was contrary to Scripture. The otherwise uneventful breakfast over, Castelli thanked his hostess and left, but a few minutes later was called back by a porter. Christina and her mother, prompted by Boscaglia, had concluded that Copernicanism was indeed contrary to Scripture, and asked Castelli's opinion on the matter. Boscaglia remained silent as Castelli presented his case, giving the debate the feel of an interrogation. The issue at stake was a passage in Joshua 10, which read, as per the freshly published King James Bible, "Then spake Joshua to the Lord in the day when the Lord delivered up the Amorites before the children of Israel. And he said in the sight of Israel, Sun, stand thou still upon Gibeon, and thou, moon, in the valley of Ajalon. And the sun stood still, and the moon stayed, until the people had avenged themselves upon their enemies." Somewhat ironically for this Catholic gathering, the same passage had been cited by Martin Luther in his rejection of Copernicus decades earlier. The next day, Castelli wrote to Galileo of the event, and on the 21st of December, Galileo responded. His letter to Benedetto Castelli was his first philosophical statement on the authority of the Church in scientific matters. In it, Galileo states that, quote, "Though the Scripture cannot err, nevertheless some of its interpreters and expositors can sometimes err in various ways, namely, to want to limit oneself always to the literal meaning of the words, for there would thus emerge not only various contradictions, but also serious heresies and blasphemies, and it would be necessary to attribute to God feet hands and eyes, as well as bodily and human feelings like anger, regret, hate, and sometimes even forgetfulness of things past, and ignorance of future ones. Thus, in the Scripture, one finds many propositions which look different from the truth if one goes by the literal meaning of the words, but which are expressed in this manner to accommodate the incapacity of common people. Nature, in contrast, is, quote, inexorable and immutable, and she does not care at all whether or not her recondite reasons and modes of operations are revealed to human understanding, and so she never transgresses the terms of the laws imposed upon her. Therefore, whatever sensory experience places before our eyes, or necessary demonstrations prove to us concerning natural effects, should not in any way be called into question on account of scriptural passages whose words appear to have a different meaning, since not every statement of the Scripture is bound to obligations as severely as each effect of nature. As for that specific passage, Galileo somewhat daringly argued that it is far more easily explained by a Copernican universe than by an Aristotelian one. As in an Aristotelian universe, God would have to halt not only the sun, but the moon, the planets, the stars, and indeed the prime mover itself, whereas in a Copernican universe, he need only halt the earth. Galileo's letter to Castelli, which he later expanded into his letter to the Grand Duchess Christina, though Christina likely never read it, was the first declaration of Galileo's scientific and religious philosophy, expressed most often today through Stephen Jay Gould's famous demarcation of non-overlapping magisteria, that the Church has its domain, and science its domain, and never the twain shall meet. The letter was soon circulating among the learned, and fell into the hands of Tommaso Caccini, Dominican monk, populist preacher, and proud member of the Pigeon League, who famously condemned it in a sermon by quoting the Acts of the Apostles. Viri Galileae, quid status adspicientes in caelum, which the King James renders as, Ye men of Galilee, why stand ye gazing up into heaven? The subtext here is fairly obvious. Rather surprisingly, Caccini's superior subsequently wrote Galileo an apology. Unfortunately, the letter to Castelli then found its way to another ardent Dominican pigeon, the Archbishop of Florence, Niccolò Lorini, who in December 1614 handed it to the Inquisition. Galileo immediately entered crisis mode. He contacted an ally in the Church, Monsignor Piero Dini, claiming in his letter that, quote, perhaps whoever transcribed it may have inadvertently changed some word. Such a change, together with a little inclination toward censure, may make things look very different from my intention. For centuries, with only later copies of the letter to hand, scholars took Galileo at his word, that his intended letter to Castelli, the most commonly found in translation today, was his original version, and that the version held by Lorini, now in the Vatican archives, was altered to appear more incriminating. Well, in 2018, a search of the documents of the Royal Society unearthed a previously unknown copy of the letter in Galileo's own hand, proving that Galileo, as he was wont, lied. The harsher version of the letter, which included such pointed wording as perverts rather than obscures, and false rather than different from the truth, was Galileo's original. Thankfully, it didn't matter. The Inquisition, upon reviewing the letter, found that, while the wording was unfortunate, the arguments were unexceptionable. In 1615, against the well-founded advice of nearly everyone he knew, Galileo determined to travel to Rome to make his case. In December, following a brief illness which was, by his own admission, at least partly psychogenic, Galileo arrived. It was here that the unstoppable force that was Galileo met its immovable object, Roberto Cardinal Bellarmine, better known to English speakers as Robert Bellarmine. Bellarmine had gained that name when James I, in response to the Gunpowder Plot, ordered all Catholics in England to submit to their king rather than the Pope. So vociferous was the war of words between James and Bellarmine over the oath, that Bellarmine became something of a national talking point. The English even began referring to the beard-men decorative jugs popular across Europe at the time as Bellarmines. Bellarmine was no raging, uninformed cleric. He was widely regarded as the greatest theologian in Christendom, and a leading light in the Counter-Reformation. Bellarmine had already adjudicated on the matter of Copernicus before Galileo arrived in Rome. In a letter to Paolo Foscarini, a Carmelite priest and Copernican, he asserted that, quote, "To say that the assumption that the earth moves and that the sun stands still saves all celestial appearances better than do eccentrics and epicycles is to speak with good sense and to run no risk whatsoever. Such a manner of speaking suffices for a mathematician. But to want to affirm that the sun is in very truth at the center of the universe is a very dangerous attitude, and one calculated not only to arouse all scholastic philosophers and theologians, but also to injure our holy faith by contradicting Scripture." It's tempting to reject Bellarmine's opinion as simple knee-jerk reactionism, but the Council of Trent, the decades-long intellectual wrangle that had strengthened the Church's defenses against Protestantism, had decreed that interpreting Scripture contrary to the opinions of the earliest Church Fathers, one of the main draws of Protestantism, was forbidden. Yes, like everything I've discussed in the series so far, Galileo's travails trace back to the Protestant Reformation. Galileo's colleague, Federico Cesi, even pondered if Copernicus could possibly have published his book had he written it after the Council of Trent. That said, Bellarmine was not absolutely opposed to heliocentrism, as he wrote to Foscarini, quote, "I say that if there were a true demonstration that the sun was at the center of the world and the earth circles the sun, then one would have to proceed with great care in explaining the Scriptures that appear contrary, and say rather that we do not understand them, that what is demonstrated is false. But I will not believe that there is such a demonstration until it is shown to me." Unquote. Bellarmine is essentially agreeing with Galileo that when a natural phenomenon is shown beyond doubt to exist in apparent defiance of Scripture, that Scripture must be reinterpreted. Bellarmine also agreed with Galileo that the Aristotelian view that the heavens were immutable and unchanging was contrary to Scripture, as that very passage in Joshua showed. But even Galileo admitted that without, quote, "a host of proofs that it is true, and that the contrary cannot be maintained at all," he was unlikely to progress. In his letter to the Grand Duchess Christina, he had written, quote, "If a proposition of secular knowledge is not proved conclusively and contains something contrary to Scripture, then, quote, it is to be reckoned undoubtedly false and shown to be so by every possible means." Unquote. When Galileo arrived in Rome, his friend and ally Christoph Greinberger, who had succeeded Christopher Clavius as head of the Jesuit Collegio Romano, told him that he'd have better luck offering proof of Copernicus than reinterpreting Scripture. And so, in January 1616, Galileo found such a proof. Or at least, he reached for one, and in the effort made the single greatest intellectual error of his life, one you won't find in kids' books. To quote Kessler again, his idea was, quote, "in glaring contradiction to fact, absurd as a mechanical theory, completely out of keeping with his intellectual stature, and not a mistake, but a delusion." Unquote. Galileo asserted, to near universal opposition, that the tides could only be explained by Earth's motion around the sun. As the Earth rotates, quote, "mixture of the annual and diurnal motions causes the unevenness of motion in the parts of the terrestrial globe. Upon these two motions being mixed together, there results in the parts of the globe this uneven motion of the ocean, now accelerated and now retarded by additions and subtractions of the diurnal rotation upon the annual revolution." There was one small problem with this idea. The day is 24 hours long. For the tides to be affected by a diurnal motion, they would have to occur once every 12 hours. But they don't. They occur once every 6 hours. Galileo somewhat optimistically suggested that the 6-hour tide was a local effect within the Mediterranean, and that he had it on good authority that the tides occur once every 12 hours in Atlantic-facing Lisbon. For the record, they don't. Also, the time of high and low tide varies in a regular fashion, something which Galileo apparently did not know, and which his theory could not explain. Ironically, Paolo Foscarini had suggested Galileo employ his own hypothesis that the east-to-west motion of the trade winds was caused by Earth's rotation, which is true. However, Possibly because he didn't come up with the idea himself, Galileo ignored it. That the tides were linked to the lunar cycle was noted in ancient Greek sources. When Kepler challenged Galileo with that fact, Galileo retorted that such an idea was occultist, likely drawn from the ancient association of the moon with water. Why would you reject the cause and take refuge in miracles? He asked. Galileo's stance was not entirely ludicrous. After all, Kepler could not explain what strange occultic force made the moon pull on our oceans, and without a physical cause, it might as well be magic. Given that 400 years later we still haven't figured out precisely what gravity is, you might cut Galileo some slack there. Also, while it fails on our world, it is possible to envision a hypothetical world in which Galileo's conception of the tides holds true. Who knows? Someday in the distant future, we may stumble upon a planet with Galilean tides. His proof in hand, Galileo felt unstoppable. Relishing the prospect of intellectual combat, he strode through Rome proclaiming the truth of Copernicanism to all who would hear it. Audiences admired his audacity but remained unconvinced by his arguments. The Tuscan ambassador to Rome, who, much against his own wishes, had been ordered to house Galileo during his stay, complained that, quote, "He is passionately involved in this fight of his, and does not see or sense what it involves, with the result that he will be tripped up and get himself into trouble, together with anyone who supports his views." Some have speculated that it was Galileo's very brashness which led to Pope Paul V, on the 19th of February 1616, to convene his meeting of the Inquisition's theologians on the compatibility of Copernicanism with Scripture. 5 days later, the group delivered their verdict. Proposition to be assessed. 1. The sun is the center of the world and completely devoid of local motion. Assessment. All said that this proposition is foolish and absurd in philosophy, and formally heretical since it explicitly contradicts in many places the sense of Holy Scripture, according to the literal meaning of the words and according to the common interpretation and understanding of the Holy Fathers and doctors of theology. 2. The earth is not the center of the world, nor motionless, but moves as a whole and also with diurnal motion. Assessment. All said that this proposition receives the same judgment in philosophy, and that regarding theological truth, it is at least erroneous in faith. Scholars more sympathetic to Galileo, possibly Cardinal Bellarmine, later removed the word heretical. Galileo was not personally mentioned in this decree. Copernicus's book was suspended until corrected, and in 1620 was allowed back into circulation with 9 sentences proclaiming the truth of heliocentrism, altered or removed. On the 26th of February, in the presence of Cardinal Bellarmine, the Inquisition directly ordered Galileo, quote, "to abandon completely the above-mentioned opinion that the sun stands still at the center of the world and the earth moves, and henceforth not to hold, teach, or defend it in any way whatsoever, either orally or in writing." Galileo acquiesced, provided that he received written confirmation that he had not, as rumors then wildly circulating had proclaimed, been made to abjure heresy. Bellarmine assented, and gave Galileo this statement: "We, Roberto Cardinal Bellarmino, having heard that it is calumniously reported that Signor Galileo Galilei has in our hand abjured and has also been punished with salutary penance, and being requested to state the truth in this, declare that said Galileo has not abjured, either in our hand or the hand of any other person here in Rome." And that was it. Galileo had been let off with a warning. If he kept his views on Copernicanism to himself, he could live his life as he pleased. And remarkably, for 15 years, he did. But Galileo was too much of a brawler to avoid confrontation forever. As Piero Guicciardini, the much-abused Tuscan ambassador to Rome, put it, if Galileo chose, quote, "to fight personalities who cannot be attacked without ruining oneself, sooner or later you will hear in Florence that he has madly tumbled into some unsuspected abyss." The Copernican universe is a dark, vast place, an abyss into which one could easily stumble. One day, Galileo would learn that it is not to be traversed idly. And that was 6 years of Galileo's life. Just 26 more to go. I think I'll be able to get them all in one video, though. Let me know if you like this 4-video format, or if you prefer the 2-video format as per Kepler. I know these videos take a while to make, but the audio of every episode is always available for my patrons up to a week before the video is published. If you can't afford that, then please like, comment, and subscribe. And I hope to see you again soon, fellow seekers.